But now I'm going to start, as I did yesterday, with it's actually a classic story, but I think you'll see the relevance, and I hope nobody's offended. This is about a first-year anatomy class in medical school, and the professor is using the Socratic method. And he says the question of the day is, what human organ, when appropriately stimulated, grows to 8 times its normal size? And he looks up at the crowd and says, Miss Johnson. And Miss Johnson says, I'm not going to answer that question. That's outrageous. And then he looks over, he says, Mr. McCormick. Mr. McCormick says, why, the pupil of the human eye when it enters a darkened room. And the professor says, Miss Johnson, I have 3 things to say to you. 1, you have a dirty mind. 2, you did not do your homework. And 3, you are doomed to live a life of unfulfilled expectations. As is obviously relevant for our topic. So yesterday I gave a roadmap for how we got here, going back on the time machine over many decades. And today it's talking about what we might do about it. The first thing I want to say is, obviously it's not going to be easy. And for a lot of the things that we need to do, it's going to require a Congress and a president willing to bite many bullets to make it happen. And we're not at that point, and we might not be there, and we have to be fearful that we might lose the opportunity looking further down the road. The second thing I will say is, I'm going to talk a lot about some of the structural changes that we could deal with. But the fact is, the biggest problem we have now in this country is a cultural one. It is that we are deeply divided, that we face sectarian differences that could easily transcend into violence, that we're divided not just across partisan lines, but across regional lines, and have states that are operating in a fashion that's completely different than others, and for some of them, careening out of control, I would say, in terms of what they're doing. And I mentioned yesterday, but I'll mention it again, just one example of that, which is Ryan Walter, the superintendent of education in Oklahoma, has commanded that elementary schools teach the Bible and teach the Christian Bible. And said yesterday that, well, the Constitution doesn't say anything about the separation of church and state. And if we're getting into that sort of thing, and today Josh Hawley, who many of you remember especially as he sprinted away from the Capitol, having already incited the violent insurrectionists, said, I am determined to make this a Christian nation, and yes, I'm a Christian nationalist, and I'm proud of it. And we've got issues, obviously, and those issues are not easily going to be solved no matter how many magic wands we might be able to wave in terms of changing some of the structures. The other thing I want to say as a predicate is the problems that we have structurally are not just problems because of Donald Trump or the emergence of a lot of the tribal divisions. They have been emerging for some time, and they're built into, unfortunately, the clash we have between the constitutional structure created by the framers and the dramatic changes that have occurred in the society over the last 200 plus years. And just to give you a couple of facts that underscore this, that I think are maybe the most important. We are almost at a point where 70% of Americans will live in just 15 of our 50 states. 50% in 8 states. Now, think about the consequence of that. And obviously, it's happened because people move where the jobs are. And, you know, you're not going to stay in North Dakota if you find that it's a stagnant economy and you can't be there. And the jobs are in the bigger states. But here are the consequences of that. It means that the Electoral College, which in the first several centuries, or the first 150 years and more of our existence, had one, arguably two, 44 elections, where you could say that the winner of the popular vote lost the presidency. Starting, of course, with 2000, we've had two of those in just a handful of elections. And what these numbers tell us is it's going to happen more frequently. Now, the first time it happened in 2000, which was, of course, extraordinarily wrenching, we didn't know for 36 days, but the public pretty much accepted it. One part of the reason being that Al Gore, who lost on a 5-4 Supreme Court vote after 36 days, very graciously said, the election's over, we need to move on. It happened again, of course, in 2016, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by more than 3 million. And the reaction, even though she also said, the election's over, I lost, the public reaction was not quite the same. If it happens a third time or a fourth time, then the sense that the election is not legitimate is going to take further hold in the country. And, you know, one response to that is, we're a republic, not a democracy. Well, in a republic, it's the people who elect their representatives still. And if the people's will is not being reflected, that's a big problem. So that's one part of it. More chilling is that this means that 30% of Americans will elect 70 of the 100 U.S. senators. And that 30% is not representative of the diversity or the economic dynamism of the nation. And it's not that all the big states are blue and all the little states are red. We have Delaware, we have Maine, and on the other side we have Florida and Texas, among others. But if you don't have a population that is increasingly diverse, reflected in the votes, and if you have what almost inevitably will happen, and it's already happened over many decades, but it'll happen even more, which is that the states that are poor are going to dominate, and they're going to demand more and more from the states that are rich. So you're not only not going to be able to have those votes at the table, but you're going to be pushed to tax more and give more for others who don't necessarily represent you. Now, if you add that to a very distorted House of Representatives, where in the constitutional system, in that republic, the House is supposed to be the one that's really responsive to the people, but it's becoming less and less responsive. And that's, of course, because partly through gerrymandering, partly through just the way people naturally congregate, concentrated in the cities and then spread out elsewhere, the House is simply not as representative, and close to 400 of the 435 seats are just about safe for one party or the other. You know, this is familiar trope, but of course the reality is that means the only contest is in a primary. The primaries push people off to the extremes. They don't have to represent as a whole, the country as a whole. And you can take as examples of that, I mean, one example we can use all the time, 90% of Americans believe we should have background checks for all guns, and it doesn't happen. And there appear to be no electoral consequences for that. And there are many, many other issues where broad public support simply doesn't translate. And so we got a crisis of legitimacy ahead unless we make some significant changes. Now, with that, I want to talk about basically three buckets where I'll offer some ideas. And I will say that many of these ideas I worked on and come through from a commission of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the oldest learned organization in the country, on citizenship. And we did a report called Our Common Purpose, and I crafted a lot of the recommendations, though not all of them, and we had a pretty broad representation across ideological lines, and it was a unanimous report. And you can find that report, if you want to read the whole thing, online at amacad, amacad.org/our common purpose. And it's well worth looking at, and we're taking it around the country. The first bucket is that around voting and citizens in the political and electoral process. And the first, something that I mentioned yesterday when Shel Seligson asked the question about one thing I would do, and that is universal voting. And again, I'll say, especially for those who weren't here, that this idea really comes from Australia. In Australia, over now 9 decades, they basically have a system they call mandatory attendance at the polls. You have to show up, and if you don't have to vote for a candidate, you can vote for none of the above. You can offer an excuse in writing, but if you don't show up and don't give that excuse, you have to pay a fine of around $15. And there's a very interesting book by the great legal scholar Cass Sunstein called Nudge, and how much you can move behavior with just minor penalties or movement. And this is one of them. Before they did this in Australia, they had turnout like ours, 50% to 60% in their national elections. Every election since has been over 90%. And it's not, as I said yesterday, that just high turnout means you automatically have health in your political system. But what they tell you in Australia, and I got a full measure of this in many visits there, meeting with leaders, and this was across the spectrum, members of their parliament and members of their cabinet, said, we know that our base is going to be there, and we know that their base is going to be there. And so trying to appeal in ways that get your base turned out, which generally means by scaring the shit out of your people about the consequences, and doing what you can to suppress the other side's base, all of which makes many political consultants very rich. We don't have to do that, because we know that what makes the difference in an election is the voters who are not a part of either base. And so we want to appeal on the larger issues that matter, not on the wedge issues that divide people. And we want to be careful a little bit with our rhetoric, because if you're not, you're going to turn off voters. And while they have plenty of pathologies in their own society, we live in a world where social media and tribal media, and frankly, every country now being manipulated by Russia, China, and other malign actors to exacerbate those divisions. But they have contained it in a way that we have not over many decades. Now, combined with that, you have to do things to make sure that if you have universal voting, that you give people the tools to vote. So you have to have same-day voter registration. We should have automatic voter registration. Almost every other developed democracy puts the burden on the state to get people registered to vote. We put the burden on the citizen and often make it much more difficult. And obviously now we know that there are many states that are deliberately targeting those burdens through onerous voter ID requirements and in other ways to keep people from getting registered. We should have, and this could be done by a congressional mandate, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And we should combine that, by the way, with education of voters on what it means to vote and what to do about it. Now, at the same time, we should move to do something that has been done in several counties and now I think could easily be spread, and that is to make, if you're voting at the polls, something that is not difficult, but something that is easy. So, as you know, when we have to go to vote now, you have one place you can vote, it's your local precinct. For an awful lot of people, if you're a working person, and especially if you are an hourly wage working person, the only time you can vote is in the rush hour periods, in the morning or at the end of the day. That's when the lines are longest, And for a lot of people, you can't do that. If you have to be at your workplace at 9 o'clock and you see a line that's 2 hours long at 7 o'clock, you can't do it. If you come back at the end of the day and there's a long line and you're tired anyhow, you can't do that. So, as a model, Larimer County, Colorado, for some time, has enabled people to vote at a vote center. And what they do is they place them in Walmarts or major grocery stores, and it has multiple benefits. You can park, you can shop at the same time. If a voting machine breaks down, if there's a paper jam, you got a lot of people there who know how to deal with a paper jam. Most voting sites now, if there's a problem with the machines, don't have anybody who can fix them. And as you know, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, our poll workers, and this is something else we have to do, we have to pay poll workers, and what I would like to do is to get high school kids get credit for being poll workers. You know, the old stereotype of a person who sees the VCR, some of you may not even remember VCRs, flashing the 12 and having no clue what to do about it. When these machines break down, you got to have somebody who can fix them, and you can have the techs there at these vote centers. The idea that I tried to push, and we actually had a little success this last time, was to have voting in stadiums and arenas, and we had several sports teams and leagues that stepped up to the plate. And in an ideal world, you can go to one of these places with your kids. You'll have some of the sports stars that are venerated widely there to greet voters. And after you voted and you show that you voted, your kids can run around the bases or shoot baskets. And that means that they will see voting as a pleasurable thing with a reward and not anything else. I also tried in the district, I have to tell you, to get a lottery. You know, if you have one of these lotteries that will pay $1 billion, you have people waiting in line in the rain for days to get a ticket, where their chances of winning, of course, are less than being struck by lightning twice at the same time. But my suggestion for the district was get a car dealer to give a big car, an Escalade or whatever it might be, and say that after the election you're going to pick 5 people off the voter rolls at random, and you're going to go to their house in order and say, this car is yours if you can show me that you voted. And all it will take is one person seeing that car drive away for the rest of the public to say, whoa, we're not going to do that. It's illegal in a lot of places, but there are lots of ways in which we can encourage voting, even if we don't have formal universal voting. But we can do it at the federal level with a law, and there's a wonderful book by E.J. Dionne and Miles Rappaport called Universal Voting, and we're taking it around. It meets a lot of resistance, obviously, because people say this is a free country, we should be free not to vote. And my response to that is, first, think about the future of the country, but second, you're free not to vote. You just have to show up. Or you don't want to do that, pay $10 or $15. So there are ways of dealing with that and getting around it. The next idea is to change Election Day to Veterans Day on a holiday. Why Veterans Day? Because the reality is that millions of Americans shed blood or died in all of our conflicts. Why? To preserve the right to vote and democracy. So if we do that in November, instead of having an election on a Tuesday when a lot of people work and can't make it, you can have it on a holiday, and you can have a period of early voting for people who have to work or who are going to be away. But we know from a lot of other countries in the experience, and what we've seen in some primaries here that have elections on Saturdays, is that you get a more robust turnout and it makes it easier for people. And by doing this, you avoid the problem of either people saying you can't have an election on a Sabbath. I mean, my alternative for that is a 24-hour period from noon Saturday to noon Sunday, so that if people have issues with Sabbath, they can avoid them. But you don't have to add a new holiday, which has a cost to the economy. Now, If we did all of those things, or if we did a combination of those things, and along with that, what I didn't mention is we have an antiquated system where you can only vote at your particular precinct because there may be local elections and you have a ballot that only works in that area. But, you know, when I rent a car and I go back to return it, somebody comes out with a little handheld device and in 30 seconds gives me the personalized printout. There is no reason why we can't use existing technology so that when somebody goes to a vote center or even goes down to vote by where they work, if it's easier, they can get a personalized ballot that reflects all of the offices and referendum or whatever it may be that they are eligible to do. We just have to have the determination and not a lot of money, but a little bit of money to make those things happen. Now, along with that, we've got a whole bunch of changes that we could do to our institutions, and let me talk a little bit about that, especially given the challenge that I mentioned at the beginning. One is I want to enlarge the House of Representatives. Now, for some of you who don't know the history, and I have to say many elected officials don't know the history, you ask people, why is the House set at 435? Well, it's in the Constitution. No, it's not. The House started with 65 members, and every census, as the population changed, increased, and moved from state to state, we adjusted the numbers. In 1910, we reached 435. And for a variety of reasons, they made no adjustment. They didn't do it again in 1920. And then in 1929, they passed a law setting the House fixed at 435. Why did they do that? Because, think back to the period around 1910. We had a massive migration into the country, coming a lot of it in through Ellis Island, some of it coming in through Texas. Odessa, Texas, by the way, is named that because you had Russians who couldn't get in through Ellis Island because the German Jews didn't want the riffraff there, who went around to Odessa. But you had conservatives who didn't want to see those immigrants have more political power because they were settling mostly in the Northeast and some moving out to the Midwest. And at the same time, you had families of former slaves moving from the South to the North who were also going to give more power to the North. It's an ages-old issue where mostly Southern conservatives figured out how to use the system to give themselves more leverage and more power. But the fact is that what the framers originally wanted, which was a House that had a cap in population for representation of 15,000 so that members could be closer to the people, then it went to 30,000 as they negotiated it. But we now have districts that are 800,000, some in some instances 1 million. And they're far from being representative, where people just don't have contact with their individual constituents, but it's also easier to manipulate redistricting. So our proposal was that we add 150 seats, which is roughly what would have happened if you look at where the seats were gained and lost. We could accommodate it in the capital community, and you would reduce the average size of the district to something like 500,000. Now that's not enough, but it will give us a great start. It will be more representative, but we added some other elements to that to make it work even better. In 1967, Congress passed a law that required single-member districts. You couldn't have multi-member districts, which we had had sometimes in the past. I want to repeal that law and add ranked choice voting. And along with that, I want to have Congress make ranked choice voting a part of all states for presidential elections. Why for presidential elections? Just as an aside, I don't want third parties, Jill Stein, Cornel West, Ralph Nader, whoever it may be, distorting the outcome of an election. But we need to have an avenue for additional parties to be a vibrant part of our political process. Far too many Americans don't see either party as being where they have a home, and that adds to the illegitimacy and sense of the system. But if we did this for Congress, it would create a very different dynamic. Those of you from Illinois may remember that up to about 1960, for many decades, their state legislature had 3-member districts, and voters could cast 3 votes for one candidate, 2 for one and 1 for another, or 1 for each of 3. Now, what were the consequences of that? The districts were more heterogeneous and therefore more representative. The candidates had every incentive to reach out beyond their narrow ideological base, because you wanted to be able to attract at least the second vote or one of the 3 votes from voters who weren't going to support you otherwise. And they had a broader range of candidates, and it moderated and created opportunities for compromise that are simply absent now from our legislature. And what we would see happening is we would get not just a range of candidates who would be have more incentives to be moderate, but we would get a broader representation of women, of people of color, of others who are not as represented in our legislature as they ought to be. And all of that can be done through legislation. Now, along with that, we should have Congress mandate independent redistricting commissions, citizens commissions, that we have in a number of states now, and Congress has the authority to do this, where many states, of course, are moving even more in the direction of both partisan and racial gerrymandering, with a Supreme Court that has given them the green light to do this over and over. And you can do this for all 50 states. They're not perfect, and some of these commissions have not done a particularly good job, but they are vastly superior to being in a situation where instead of voters choosing their representatives, representatives choose their voters, which is what we have now in far too many places. Now, let me move as well to what we might do about the Senate, because that's a much tougher nut to crack. If you think about 30% electing 70 senators, that means enough to overcome any veto of a president, to be able to block treaties from occurring, to deal with any kind of filibuster or rules that would be destructive of acting on the problems facing the country. I'll just talk for a second about the filibuster, an area where I have been involved for many decades, including testifying in the Senate Rules Committee along with Walter Mondale back in 2011, where I offered an idea that actually Senator Al Franken, my friend, promoted, and I thought we had a chance of making it happen. I'm not going to go into all the weeds on this, but as you know, the way the filibuster works now, and this is from a reform that occurred in 1975, you can filibuster any piece of legislation now, and it takes 3/5 of the Senate, which means 60 votes to overcome it. Before that, it was 2/3, but 2/3 of those present and voting. And what that meant is, if you wanted to overcome a filibuster, you could go around the clock, set up the cots, and if the people who were filibustering didn't show up, then you would actually maybe only need 40 votes or 50 votes to invoke cloture, move on, and get action on a bill. This is a little story that Al told when he first came to the Senate. He was trying to reach out to other members, and he said to Jim Bunning, who some of you may remember as a Hall of Fame pitcher, but who also served in the Senate from Kentucky, who was a very cantankerous individual. I'll tell you, partly bitter because he was the only one who had pitched no-hitters in both the American and National League, and he never made more than $100,000. And when he was in the Senate, he saw these ball players making millions, and it just pissed him off immensely. But Al said to him one Wednesday, see you next Monday. And Bunning looked at him and said, no, you won't. There's a filibuster going on. You have to be here. I don't. All the minority needed, promoting the filibuster, was one person to keep them from doing anything by unanimous consent. So my idea is that you just switch around, and instead of 60 needed to end debate, 41 needed to continue debate. The way a filibuster is supposed to work, and the way it worked, I will tell you, isn't just the rule. After 1975, we still had very few filibusters because the norms were that you only did a filibuster for an issue of major national significance, most of them, by the way, bipartisan, and that you were going to highlight this and debate it and deliberate about it, hoping you could educate people as to why this was a bad idea, but showing you felt intensely enough about it that you would put yourselves on the line. Now you lift your little finger and you can do a filibuster, and they do it on almost everything, minor bills, major bills. It has become a weapon of mass obstruction because you can use an enormous amount of time on the Senate floor, even for something that might end up passing overwhelmingly or even unanimously. So if you put the burden back on the minority, it's not going to happen all that often, and it's only going to happen where people feel so intensely that they are willing to go all out, and you'll be able to highlight those things. So bring up a bill that would, for example, codify Roe v. Wade. Do a filibuster and take it to the country and force them, because it'll be a drama and it'll get covered, to explain why, or why they're against universal background checks, or why they're okay with bump stocks and with assault weapons, or any of those issues. And it can go both ways, of course, why you're against doing things for law and order. Make them debate and make them suffer for it. And I thought we were going to get it done because I thought Joe Manchin, who actually publicly said that's a good idea and a good way to go, and then reneged on it at the end, not the first time, and now that he's retiring, perhaps the last time. But obviously you need to have enough members beyond the 50 needed, the way the rules now work, to make that happen. But it would make a difference in the Senate, even one that is increasingly distorted. Now, along with that, I think we have to make the Senate more responsible and, more representative by adding the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico. Frankly, if I had my druthers, I would also add the U.S. Virgin Islands and Guam and give them the representation that they deserve. They can vote in presidential elections, but they have no other representation that makes any difference. And it's not that all of them would be Democrats. Puerto Rico regularly elects Republicans, including their non-voting representative to Congress, many of their governors. But you would, help to at least ameliorate the problem of an unrepresentative body. And, if we have to be pushed, remember, going back to an earlier theme, there used to be a Dakota Territory. It's North Dakota and South Dakota. It was sparsely populated back then. It's even more sparsely populated now. Why did they make it North Dakota and South Dakota? So they could add 2 more agrarian senators. Why is there a Virginia and a West Virginia when it used to be Virginia? Same sort of thing. All right, a Northern California, a Southern California. Maybe 7 Californias, whatever. That obviously is not likely to happen, and it's out of the box, but it tells you something about how we got to the state that we're in. It's not just, when the framers created the country and they had to make all these adjustments and compromises to get the states to agree to a constitution, the ratio of population between the smallest and largest states was about 10 to 1 or 12 to 1, and now it's 70 to 1. And it just makes no sense that we give Wyoming more power than we do California in proportional terms. The other thing that I would do, and the difficulty with the Senate is constitutionally there's a little catch-22 and a kicker. It's not just in Article 1. Article 5 codifies that every state will have equal representation in the Senate. Again, something that the slave states wanted to put in to make sure that it wouldn't be changed. Now, presumably you could have a constitutional amendment that eliminated that provision of Article 5, but that would be more difficult. What I would like to see, without changing the fact that every state has equal representation, is to add maybe 12 senators who are elected regionally or maybe even some elected nationally. And that way, you're going to have people who aren't bound to a state, who, even though they have equal votes in the Senate, are going to have some clout. And we can alter this problem of an increasingly disproportionate and unrepresentative Senate. With that, let me talk about campaigns and campaign finance, where not just Citizens United, but a combination of other decisions and the deliberate defanging of the regulatory regime through the Federal Election Commission have created a very bad situation, one where dark money and big money dominate even more. We have a Supreme Court. I will tell you that I had played some role in what became the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act known as McCain-Feingold, and Citizens United blew that apart. But before Citizens United, the challenge to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act brought by Mitch McConnell, it was a decision called McConnell versus FEC, we prevailed. And we prevailed in significant part because Sandra Day O'Connor, we were talking about her earlier at breakfast, who used to come here to Chautauqua a fair amount, who is the only elected official in the Supreme Court, someone who'd been elected before, and understood the realities, voted with us. Citizens United blew up that decision after Justice Roberts lied in his confirmation hearings about respecting stare decisis, and this was just a few years, but that's a whole other story that we won't get into. But it's worth even considering, although it's a steeply uphill battle, a constitutional amendment that would grant Congress the authority to set laws that would regulate spending and contributions in campaign finance. At the same time, we can do more by enacting full disclosure laws to move away from the dark money that's there, to empower the IRS to step in where we see abuses of these things. And we could also push, at least at the federal level, for clean elections in states, for the federal elections there, that include, as we have in many states, in New York City, matching funds. They do in New York City 6-to-1 matching funds for small contributions after a candidate's over a threshold showing that they're a legitimate candidate, to give more role to small donors over big donors. There are other ideas that are really a little bit outside the box, but that could be interesting. One is what's called democracy vouchers. They actually tried this in Portland, Oregon for a while. And that is every voter gets 2 or 4 $25 vouchers that they can use to give to candidates or parties. You can't transfer them to others. But it's a form in some ways of public financing, but it's public financing not necessarily by just giving money directly to candidates, but empowering voters. And it would give candidates more of an incentive to reach out broadly to voters to be able to get those vouchers. Back in the day, there used to be a federal tax credit for campaign contributions. It was a 50% credit up to $50. And it got taken out in the major tax reform that eliminated a lot of the deductions and credits, despite efforts to keep it in. The fact is that when we had that tax credit, we had a surge in small donations. There are states like my native Minnesota where there's still a tax credit and you get a lot more money coming in if people know it's not like you're giving them something directly or something that they can use to put money in their own pockets. And in fact, there's a cost to it. You give your contribution, you have to wait till the tax return to get the deduction. But it provides a surge in contributions. And frankly, one of the advantages of having more and more people involved in that level is they have skin in the game. And they're going to pay more attention to what's going on. They're going to pay more attention to what candidates have to say. So there are a lot of advantages in doing things like that. And while they may require a little funding, what used to be deep public objections to using public money this way to presumably enrich politicians, the aftermath of Citizens United and its progeny, the fact that we have so much dark money, and even money that isn't necessarily dark by billionaires pouring it into campaigns and overwhelming what candidates can raise, and overwhelming the dialogue. A campaign's supposed to be candidates pitted against each other. When you have, Citizens for a Better America, where nobody knows who they are, pouring millions into a campaign towards the end, using all the television and radio time so that candidates can't get it, that's not the way a campaign is supposed to operate. Now let me talk a bit about the Supreme Court. Although I get Spilkes in the Genectigazoid every time I have to talk about this Supreme Court. We have a court that's out of control in so many ways. The failure to have a code of ethics for the Supreme Court that applies to every other federal judge, the failure to have any sanctions for corrupt behavior is a scandal of immense proportions in the country. And here too, I blame Chief Justice Roberts for saying nothing and doing nothing, and then eventually, under enormous pressure, passing a sham code of ethics that actually codifies a lot of what those members have done. That's one small thing. But we have to obviously think bigger. I have for 25 years been a proponent of term limits for justices, and I believe that that can be done without a constitutional amendment. Why? Even though the Constitution says that justices serve in good behavior, which means effectively for life unless impeached and removed from office, it doesn't say that they have to serve as active Supreme Court justices. So you can say, if you have 9 members of the court, an 18-year term limit, and after that, you can either move to senior status or you can join a court of appeals. So it's doable, I think, and it would make a difference in so many ways. I'll just give you a little anecdote, which is that I became friends with a very conservative appeals court judge in Richmond, Virginia, named J. Harvey Wilkinson. J. Wilkinson, as he's known. Very conservative, but a stellar mind and absolute integrity, somebody who would follow the Constitution and not his own ideological leanings or partisan leanings. And he was on the short list for the Supreme Court under George W. Bush, but didn't make it because he was 60 years old. And now, very different from what we had seen in past decades, but now the incentive for the parties, knowing that you may be out of power, but you can have people who will be there for 30 years after you've left, is to pick younger people. That's why we have Sam Alito instead of Jay Wilkinson, and I can guarantee you we would be in a very better place. Not changing the fundamental ideology, but changing the ethical standards and the willingness to actually believe in a structure and follow it instead of saying, here's the outcome that I want and I'll figure out a way to rationalize it. And the same is true of the wonderful patriot whom I've gotten to know and love, Michael Ludig, who otherwise was denied the ability to serve on the court because of age. So that's one big advantage, but it also means that the stakes in a Supreme Court confirmation are a little bit lower You're not picking somebody who will be there for 40 years. You're picking somebody who will be there for 18 years. A single 18-year term. That's what we've had for the Comptroller General of the United States. And it means that you have your independence, but you serve during a prime period and then you're gone. So that's one thing. But I think we need to move beyond that. The numbers on the Supreme Court have changed many times throughout history, sometimes going up, actually even going down. But they were set at 9 for one particular reason. There were 9 circuits besides the D.C. Circuit at that time. There are now 13. So there is every reason to have 13 justices on the Supreme Court. The argument against, of course, is, well, if you do it now, then they'll do it the next time, and before long we'll have 100 justices. I'm willing to take that risk to be able to change the way things are done. And by the way, if you have even just consider the 9 justices, if you stagger them as we go forward, it means that every presidential term you have 2 vacancies to fill. What has happened in our court is we are subject to the actuarial tables and the vagaries of life because some presidents have been able to have 4 in a single term and others have been shut out completely. One of the great tragedies that we have is that Sandra Day O'Connor left the court prematurely because her husband John had Alzheimer's and she thought she was going to have years of having to take care of him. And soon after she left, and she was pushed by Chief Justice Rehnquist to leave when he left as well, shortly after that, as we know, John fell right off the table and ended up being in a facility. And if she had stayed on the court, and she told many of us that she regretted that decision, even as she regretted even more Bush v. Gore, but that's a completely different story. That changed the course of history as a consequence, and we should try and make sure we at least ameliorate those possibilities. Now, there's another radical step, but that fits completely within the Constitution. The Constitution gave the Supreme Court and other courts that Congress could, lower courts could create, original jurisdiction. And they specified the original jurisdiction. It's anything involving treaties, admiralty and maritime law, controversies between states and between a citizen of one state and another state, controversies between citizens of different states or citizens or states and a federal entity or federal government. That's it. In this last term, when we saw so many consequential decisions, only one case involved the original jurisdiction. The Supreme Court, which I used to take my students to the National Archives, where you had the whole Constitution there, and you could look at it, and it's a visual representation. Article 1 on the Congress is twice as long as Article 2 on the President, which in turn is twice as long as Article 3 on the judiciary. Those are not accidents. While we had 3 equal branches, the framers made it clear that Congress was going to be the supreme decider. President can veto bills, Congress can override those vetoes, and he has no recourse, just as one example. They set narrow jurisdiction for a Supreme Court and left it up to Congress to decide what else would be done. Of course, it was fundamentally changed with an arbitrary decision by Chief Justice Marshall, with the decision Marbury versus Madison, and it basically expanded to this judicial review. We now have a Supreme Court that has usurped the power of the other 2 branches in a fashion that I believe would make the framers aghast. And so you can, by law, and a very smart member of Congress from Illinois has introduced a bill to do this, restrict their original jurisdiction, and you could actually take away their appellate authority and give it to the D.C. Circuit, say. Now, obviously, that is not just a shot across the bow. That is a torpedo directly into the court. But frankly, I'd like to see at least a dialogue about that would educate Americans and make it clear to the court that they have far exceeded the authority that they are supposed to have, relying on a fracturing of norms in the society. I might note that when we had this controversy over court packing back with Roosevelt, and it was rejected, but it had a profound impact. It took a court that was trying to thwart every New Deal initiative that he had and made it clear to them that if they continued to overstep those boundaries, there would be consequences, and they changed what they were doing. I'm not sure anything will change these justices, but getting a much larger focus on what their appropriate role is and where they have exceeded those bounds would be a good thing to do. Finally, let me just talk about the third bucket, and that's the cultural issues. When Shell asked me yesterday what's the one thing I would do, and I said universal voting, if I had a second thing, it would be universal national service. We have come close before, but haven't done it, and either 1 year or 2 years for everybody. You can serve in the military, you can serve in a nonprofit capacity, you can do some of the things that we had in the 1930s, helping to build roads, clean up parks, whatever it may be. If you have to do this first, it teaches you that you are a part of a larger society, and while you get benefits from that society, you have a larger obligation. Second, it does what for many decades the military did, which is it puts you together with people from widely different backgrounds. And not everybody, but many began to see people in a different way when they had to work side by side with them. Obviously, it's different if you're in a foxhole with somebody and you rely on them to protect your life. But even if you're working alongside them, cleaning up trash in parks for a year, you're going to have a different perspective on things. At the same time, give people benefits for this. If you do your service and you do it well, maybe you'll get some more forgiveness on student loans, or maybe states even can provide, as they do now. Many states, if you have a certain grade point average, you can get reduced or free tuition. Give people benefits of that sort. Give them incentives so that they don't do this reluctantly, but do it because it'll be worthwhile. But over time, you're going to inculcate in people a different sense of what the society is all about. Now, along with that, we should do more experiments with what are called citizen assemblies. Not that we necessarily have them making decisions, but what we used to have in New England and other places, where you bring people together, you give them a problem, you set them in small groups and ask them to think about and work through and solve that problem. They get a better understanding of the nuances involved and the trade-offs involved in making decisions. And at some point, you can empower them in different areas so that there's a sense that you're actually not just voting for people who may or may not do anything that you want or may not pay attention to you, but you can actually play a role in all of this. I'll just mention a couple of other things. An idea that I had that I actually tried very hard to implement working with Sandra Day O'Connor and Ken Burns. I had this idea, starting at the national level, but also at the states, of doing a contest in schools. Write an essay with one idea that would make the political system at any level work better, and they would be adjudicated, and the winners would come to Washington, maybe meet with the president, meet with Congress, give their ideas. Part of the reason for this is whatever ideas I or other old fogies might come up with, there are kids who probably are going to have things that we would never think of. The second is that every civics and history and social studies teacher in the country would leap at this because it would engage their kids and get them involved, and it gives them a way of talking about it. Kids would discuss it around the kitchen table, and parents who were uninvolved would become more involved. And contests work. They get people's juices flowing. We never got this accomplished, in part because the civics group that Justice O'Connor created just didn't have the bandwidth, especially as she began to fade. And you need champions who really push this forward. You can get businesses who would contribute. But we need to engage people more and have incentives to engage them in thinking about what's working and what isn't working and why it isn't working and what we can do about it. And finally, I want to talk about debate. So I want to talk about debate for a couple of reasons. When our son died, we had to think about what we were going to do in his memory. He had been a national champion high school debater, and his debate partner, who was his best friend, said he was out in Los Angeles and working with the Los Angeles Urban Debate League. We need to get kids from backgrounds who are not going to have access to the resources that the Tony private schools and the rich public schools do and teach them debate. So we have a summer debate camp which starts next Monday. We're going to have probably 250 public school kids, almost all Title I schools, from 6th grade through high school. And they learn, first of all, they learn life skills, and it's an escalator up. We do a college fair. The colleges flock because they know kids who know debate are not going to be fazed by anything, and they're going to be better prepared than anybody else. But also, it's policy debate. There's one topic a year. You don't know going into a round in a tournament whether you have to argue the affirmative or the negative, and that means you will often have to argue positions that are utterly anathematic to you, but you have to put yourself inside the heads of people who believe those things. I will tell you that the Parkland shooting, one of the great tragedies of our time, in Broward County, which has many drawbacks. We've talked about mental health, Miami-Dade County, the subject of our documentary, Judge Leifman, who was here, has done marvelous things. Broward's done nothing on that front, and that's partly why this person shot up the school. But it's a requirement that you take speech or debate. And those kids had taken speech, and their topic was gun control and the gun issue. And the ones who survived, the David Hogues and others, who then went out and argued about it, knew what they were talking about, but they also knew the arguments on the other side and could deal with them. And you have to do it in a civil fashion. So, expanding debate and trying to get people to focus on what our institutions are supposed to be about. You know, our framers called our legislature a Congress, not a parliament. Why? Parliament comes from the French meaning parler, to speak. But it's not about debate, really, except in a very different way. Parliamentary system, you have a government, you have an opposition. Everybody knows the government decides, the opposition opposes, that's legitimate, but the way the opposition plays a role is question time. And that's pretty much it. There isn't really a debate about what you're going to do that then results in an outcome. The outcome is already known. The majority is going to vote for it, but you can challenge at least. Congress comes from the Latin word meaning to come together. And the idea was in this extended republic with people living radically different lives, some concentrated in cities like Philadelphia that actually had more people jammed together in smaller spaces than what we have now. Others living in rural areas where you might not see other human beings for a long time. Bring them together, face to face, debate and deliberate. Put yourself in others' shoes. And organically, the hope was, you would come to a resolution that would be more broadly acceptable. Because even those who lost could say, we had our say, we understand. We don't have any of that now. And we don't have it in the society. So ideally, if we get past the current impasse, and God knows we should, and I'll just end with this, one of the great Chautauquans sitting at the back, Maureen Raveno, who was the director of the religious studies program here for a long time and is still very active here, told us the other day that she saw a plaque, stumbled on it near her house that said, "There will be miracles." So Whether you believe in a God or any God or not, pray like hell that we have a miracle this November. Thank you. So as we move to questions, just let me say what I didn't at the beginning, which is the Everett House is a jewel on the campus of the Chautauqua Institution. I thank Edith Everett and her late husband, Henry. Edith will be here later in the season, for what they did with this vision to create this house with so many others that do such spectacular things. As I said yesterday, somebody came up to us after our program last week on mental health and said, I'm not Jewish, but the Everett House has the best programming on the campus. And help us keep that going. But in the meantime, there's a microphone here, and please come to the mic and ask your questions. And I'm sorry for those outside, but I'll be able to, I hope, help with those as well.
Norm, thank you. Informative and inspirational. I have two questions. A year ago, almost to the day, you talked about the fact that we were 2 states away from a constitutional convention.
Yeah.
What does that mean for us where we are today? And my second question is, I agree with everything you've said. I have a personal concern or fear that we're in a structural environment which would make it very difficult to accomplish much of that. I would ask you, which is the one thing of all those ideas that we have the best shot at trying to get done in the reasonably foreseeable future?
Sure. So on the latter, yeah. So there are two parts to the question. One is that a year ago I was asked about a constitutional convention, and we are 2 states away from calling a constitutional convention. And the second was basically we're in a tough place, and how do we get out of that? I think. Oh, and the one thing that one thing that we could get done. Sorry. So on the former, I am very scared about a constitutional convention. Admittedly, it may be the only way we can get some of the things done that I've talked about, but here's why I'm scared. The original constitutional convention had giants like James Madison and Ben Franklin. The current constitutional convention would have pygmies. And, basically you would have big forces on the left and the right, and we would end up with, however you chose the delegates, more like people who would emulate the late Rush Limbaugh, or who would emulate the members of the Squad, or whatever it might be. And while it's true that if they pass out amendments, they still have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, you can't really count on that, and we could get actually the opposite of what we're looking for. Things that would, I can imagine, for example, passing a constitutional amendment that would take the Second Amendment and remove entirely the provision on a well-regulated militia. So there are a lot of bad things. So I'm hesitant to endorse that, although we need to have a discussion about the Constitution. And I should add one other thing, that if we can't get universal voting, I'd at least like to see a constitutional amendment that makes voting a right, because it's not there for every American. And there's actually a very good book by a great legal scholar named Rick Hasson on just that. In terms of the one thing that we could probably get done, it's probably not a structural thing, although there is some support on both parties for enlarging the House, but that would be national service. Structural changes that used to be not seen in a partisan light. Now, if they're proposed by one party, they are almost automatically, reflexively opposed by the other. This ought not to be one of those things. Yes.
Jackie, I'm from Virginia, and I really appreciate all that you've shared with us yesterday and today. So you're an election expert, And I would love to hear you comment on the election integrity movement on the right, which I have been looking at for quite some time, and I call the election manipulation effort. I see it as essentially taking Stop the Steal and trying to solidify several of the Stop the Steal claims. And I have great fears about its impact on the 2024 election, given how coordinated the election integrity movement is and how much money is in it, and how long they've been training up people to watch the polls, to stop people from cheating, et cetera.
So, we know that there are a lot of people in the country, including some in prominent offices, and including Donald Trump, who basically believe that the only election that's fair is one in which we win. But they've also created this urban myth about voter fraud. And we have study after study after study done by the widest range of people that there is almost zero in-person election fraud. Why? Because the cost of being an individual who then votes in 3 or 4 different places for the benefit that comes from it is just too great. You're going to have to hop around all day or find different ways of manipulating. If you look at one of the best election officials we have is a Republican named Stephen Richer, who's the top election official in Maricopa County, Arizona, constantly under siege from the right there. And he constantly tries very calmly to put down some of these myths. And by the way, one of the biggest and most pernicious myth makers on this is Elon Musk, who's using his platform to promote these vicious and destructive lies. So if you're thinking about buying a Tesla, think again. Or about going up in a SpaceX rocket. I would recommend strongly against it. The fact is that the little bit of election fraud that we have, which is people voting in a jurisdiction where they're not supposed to, or people voting for their dead spouses, is coming from Republicans. And one of the things that I found most outrageous is in Florida, where you had a referendum that gave the franchise back to felons who'd completed their sentences. And a number of people were told by authorities that they could vote. And then Ron DeSantis rounded up a dozen of them, threw several of them in jail before the charges were dismissed. Then you had a dozen or more cases in the villages of Trump supporters who voted for dead spouses or voted multiple times, and nothing happened to them. So it's not just what reality is, it's how you put it through the prism of people who are making these decisions, and that's difficult, and it's difficult to convince people. Now, at the same time, there are people who vote in a jurisdiction where when they've moved, and they have voted in the place that they've left, but either they're not doing it intentionally or it's caught in the system. And one of the things that we could do that the Election Assistance Commission has recommended is having a nationwide bank so you can tell whether people are either voting in 2 places when they shouldn't or are voting where they're not supposed to vote, and you can take those votes out.
Eric is that organization.
Yeah.
Eric, and the conservatives are moving to get out of Eric, claiming that it's project.
There's an attempt to remove all the authorities who regulate the process legally, and of course a massive effort to elect election officials who are going to tilt it in the wrong way. And it's one of those areas where we have to be very vigilant. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is there's the Putin model and there's the Orban model. And we could slide into the Orban model. If you look at Hungary, which remains a member of NATO and of the European Union, they have the structures that seem to be there for a democracy, but it's a Potemkin village. They have elections. They're predetermined, and they do just the sorts of things to make sure that voting works the way they want. They have an independent judiciary, but it would do absolutely nothing that would conflict with what the dictator wants. They have a press corps that is ostensibly free, but if you are free and decide to criticize, suddenly you're arrested for some made-up crime, or you face a tax bill that puts you out of business, or you end up with that tax bill being purchased by a friend of Orban. We could end up there too, and we have to be very vigilant. Thank you. Young man.
Shel Seligson from Philadelphia. Let me give you a hypothetical about the United States Supreme Court. The Constitution doesn't require justices to be members of the bar, to be lawyers. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that. Take the situation where, God forbid, Donald Trump wins again, wins the Senate, decides to put a billionaire friend of his, who's given him a lot of money, on the United States Supreme Court. Do you think that a Senate elected by his followers would go along with that, would permit that to happen?
To be blunt, I think that Senate would confirm a potted plant. But you don't need to worry about him putting a billionaire on the court. It would be Justice Aileen Cannon and probably Justice Matthew Kaczmarek, who is in Amarillo, who now, because we have, and this is something else I want to see Congress pass a law, the idea that any random district judge can put an injunction that is nationwide and that you can shop and go, because Amarillo, Texas has one federal judge, district judge. So all of these cases that are restricting women's reproductive rights, that are restricting voting rights and the like, go down to Matthew Kaczmarek, a Trump appointee. Those are the kinds of people he would pick. But I can almost guarantee you that if you have 51 Republican senators, you're going to get 50 votes consistently for anybody he nominates. And that's a frightening thought. And it's almost guaranteed that soon after, if he wins the presidency, that Justices Thomas and Alito will find a way to retire so that he can pick much younger people who will then serve for a very long period of time.
He could put his son Barron on the court.
Well, he might, his daughter is a lawyer. The younger daughter, who was sort of out of the picture entirely, went to Georgetown Law School. But I can guarantee you he wouldn't try to put Melania on the court. Yes.
I'm Lori Zuckerman from Ohio, and I was intrigued by something you talked about yesterday, that Newt Gingrich had a very long-term plan to change Congress. I think you said it took like 18 years, but
16
maybe his plan
years.
was 12. So you seem so knowledgeable of what people are thinking about in terms of all these structural reforms. Does anybody have a 16-year plan that you know of? And are people even thinking in those terms? And if they are, is there enough time, given what's going on right now?
A great question, Lori. One thing I will say, talking about so many of these things that I talked about seem like pie in the sky. And right now they are, obviously. And right now, let's face it, we need triage. We have to get through this without losing the system entirely or losing it for generations. But I've been doing this stuff for over 50 years, and sometimes it takes a long time to get almost anything done. You have to have plans ready to go on the shelf for when you have the perfect storm and a group together who are ready and willing to do it. Frankly, to get most of this done, it will probably require a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Senate that has 53 or 54 at least Democrats, because some are going to resist. Because critical to a lot of it is altering the filibuster. I don't want to eliminate it. I don't think you need to eliminate it. There are things that, if you want to provide at least some opportunities for intense minorities, which I hope are not just partisan ones, but that'll be a requirement. But we got to be ready for it. And there are people who are focused on these things, including many in Congress. Sean Casten, who I alluded to earlier, a congressman from Illinois, Don Beyer, a terrific congressman from Virginia, and Jamie Raskin, among others. There are a number of people, including some really impressive women on the House Judiciary Committee. There are people in the Senate, like Sheldon Whitehouse, who are thinking about this. We don't know how long all of them will be there, but there will be plans for it. And we have to prepare with the hope that we will find an atmosphere at a moment when we can make some of these changes that will restore a system that works. There are others who want more radical change, more proportional representation, or some kind of parliamentary system. Those are much tougher and harder to do. We have to think, if optimistically, practically. But if we're going to preserve this society for generations to come, if we're going to have the fundamental freedoms that we want, if we're going to have some level of decency and integrity in the system, if we can move away from the coarsening of culture, there isn't a day that goes by, although yesterday was one, where I don't refer to my late friend and mentor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who wrote this seminal piece called Defining Deviancy Down, which is you have a certain set of norms, and if they move to a lower level, that becomes the new norm. And the fact is the new normal is entirely abnormal, and we have to find a way to get back. I haven't talked about the current crisis that we have very much. I believe in this election, what is fundamental is there are two ways to frame it. One is it's about Biden. It's about not just his age, but people who don't like his policies, think that inflation has been bad and all of that. And if that's the issue, I think he loses. The other is that this is an existential threat to America, and the frame of the election is, are you for a society that venerates and upholds decency, integrity, democracy, and fundamental freedoms? And if that's the frame, I believe there are enough Americans who will respond the right way, and we can prevail. And what we need to do is begin to move. This is one other area. We will not survive if we have one party, flawed as all of our parties are, and one cult. We need two vibrant, problem-solving parties. The fact is the Republican Party that would be a vibrant, problem-solving party is basically a Liz Cheney type party. It's a very conservative party. That's just fine. Let us have robust debates. We can go toe-to-toe on what we ought to do in policy. But I will tell you, I think that the way Liz Cheney framed this election is, to me, the right way. She says, Joe Biden's policies are anathema to me. We can survive 4 years of bad policies. We cannot survive if we give up on the Constitution and the system. And that's what we have to do now. We need to make sure we get through this impasse. And there are going to be future elections if we can restore that process, where there are people elected whose views are anathema to me and to many of you. Fine. That's what a democracy is about, and that's how it works. But if we don't get through this, all of this that we've been talking about goes right out the window. So let's all get to work, and what we can do is to try and change that frame, because the alternative is absolutely frightening. And I'm not just talking about one individual. Go read the synopsis of Project 2025. Among other things, the education plan is to not just abolish the Department of Education, it's to take away every subsidy that goes to poor neighborhoods and poor kids. It's to recreate even more second-class citizens. I will tell you that at the end of our debate camp, we have a tournament and an awards ceremony, and I always start by saying, I believe in equal opportunity, but there's nothing equal when some people start 25 yards behind the starting blocks and others start 25 yards ahead, and we're going to get you to the starting blocks, and then you will have the opportunity with your own drive and your own intelligence, and some of these kids will blow you away with their talents. What they want to do is to send people 50 yards behind the starting blocks, and they want to destroy public education, which they're doing in many states now, with voucher plans where tax dollars are going from public education, mostly to rich people who already have their kids in private schools, and basically to create a set of schools that will indoctrinate people with what they believe and keep them from learning what they don't like. That's only one small part of this. And we all have to mobilize to make sure everybody knows what's there and to make sure that we frame this the right way. And frankly, we can't rely on our mass media to do the work for us. They're doing work mostly against us right now. We have to do that. Those of us who have the resources and the skills and the credibility in our communities to try and make that happen. And yes, it's a presidential election that's basically going to be decided in 7 or 8 states and by small groups. But there are other elections for the House and the Senate and elections at the state level, which have as much to do with the future of the country as anything else. So let's all get to work. And thank you very much.